He's one of the happiest people that we know at KindredHQ, and here he is in full Steve Lawson Technicolor.
Hello, I'm Steve Lawson, and I have a rather interesting portfolio career. The hub at the centre of the wheel is I'm a musician, but the spokes that come out of that lead me to be a social technologist and a teacher and a writer and, yeah, a whole host of other things. From being a self-employed musician, from managing my own career over the last 12 or 13 years, I have developed an understanding of how communication and communities form online, and so I help people with that as well, which is kind of fun. I have I guess I have a portfolio career, because back in the 90s I was a journalist as well. I lucked my way into writing for music magazines by meeting the editor of Bassist magazine in a shop and saying, I can do that. I was a posh Yossi Hughes. And so yeah, I started doing that, and so I write a lot. I tend to write a lot these days for the web more than print, but I write, I play obviously music, and I release music, and then I help run an organisation called Amplified. And what we do is we help to enable and amplify conversations around events. So we realise that often the most interesting stuff going on at particularly kind of tech and social sector events, that the most interesting stuff wasn't the thing that was happening on the platform, it was the conversations around it. So we came up with a way of enabling that conversation to be heard beyond the 2 or 3 people who were having the conversation. And from that, we've gone on to look at the way that events are organised, the way that people talk, and the kind of spaces that facilitate that online. So it's a sort of ongoing beta project, but yeah, I mean, it's nice because it runs alongside the music quite well. That my kind of big project with the music is how to make music that's important without pretending that I'm special. I like the idea of the music having its own sort of gravity, and making it as friendly and shareable as possible. That, you know, taking those recorded entities and using the web to let people tell their own stories with them. And that's kind of what we do with Conversations in Amplified, that it's about taking these conversational elements and allowing people to use them and share them and project their own sense of the kind of importance or narrative context on top of them. No, I've never had a normal job. Well, the last time I had anything approaching a normal job was 6 weeks in a jumper factory when I left college at the age of 20. Before I went off to be a musician. In between college and going on tour, I had about 10 weeks, 6 of which were spent in the factory, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that was the last time I did anything remotely normal. Ever since then, I've been either playing or recording or writing. And it's always been portfolio. And it's been really interesting to see how the friends of mine who had fixed jobs will go through good times and very lean times, because it's quite binary. You've either got a job or you haven't. Whereas I was always able to shift the emphasis around, because I suppose the other string to my bow is that I'm a teacher. And so when I wasn't gigging much, I could teach. I teach bass privately. I got to a point where I was lecturing in universities and colleges. I did demonstrations for various equipment companies. So I was able to be quite entrepreneurial about it, I guess. That's not a word I'd normally apply to myself just because it feels a bit businessy. But yeah, I guess it was that I was able to find different ways of turning what I did into some kind of income, and it meant that it was much more stable. I've had very few sort of big spikes within that. Very few times when I've suddenly earned loads of money, but I've had consistent work, and it's been consistently interesting. That if when people say, "Well, what do you do in a sentence?" It's I'm professionally curious. I just find things that are interesting and do them, and whether that's music, playing the music that I love rather than other people's music most of the time, or having conversations with really interesting people. I mean, the stuff that we get to do with Amplified is amazing. Most of the events are things I would have gone to anyway, because we can be quite choosy. We found that the business world in general didn't like our openness. That they often have, people have this concept of commercial sensitivity to a lot of what goes on at their events, and we were resolutely not that. We were initially Nesta funded. The whole idea is that it's non-profit and it's about the conversations, and so the conversations had to have their own integrity to be worth anything, because quite rightly a lot of that kind of space is seen to be kind of occupied by sort of murky PR type things where things are pretending to be conversational but are actually paid PR, and that's not what we're doing at all. We wanted to find something different. We wanted it to be about real conversation. So the places where we were most welcome were government, charity, third sector, arts and education. Those are all places that I like being. I find the project of being human quite interesting, and so all the things that play into that I tend to do. Yeah, I think that having a life has become more important than making a living. That the idea that I know more and more people whose focus is on turning their passions and their actual expertise into something that is sustainable, rather than pursuing the kind of 70s dream of a job for life, no matter what. I think that disappeared in the late 80s, early 90s. My generation came out of school, I left school in 91, and we came out with a sense of that the aspirations of the past weren't going to work for us. There's sort of sociological studies done that suggest that grunge represented that in the way that punk represented the collapse of the sort of 70s work ethic and the dawn of the Thatcherite era. Well, at the end of that the 90s, when we realised that the yuppie boom was totally unsustainable, and that from a sort of work perspective, it was never going to do what the previous generation would have expected work to do for them. We were able to start to sort of think a bit differently about that. And so I never thought career-wise at all about anything. It's all been very expedient it's how do I manage to keep doing what I'm doing? And I still think about that with music, that rather than thinking about building a career in music, it's can I still be making music next year? I want the music making to be sustainable. I want it to be creatively free. I don't like the idea of being caught playing music for any reason other than itself. But once it's there, I'm more than happy to invite people to come and be a part of that and enjoy it, because that sort of shared sense of importance in it is a lot of what gives it its value. Toby Moores, who runs Amplified with me, who is the convener of Amplified, he has this term that he uses, reciprocal altruism, where and it contrasts quite strongly, I think, with the sort of the contemporary notion of enlightened self-interest, in that we do good because the likelihood is that everybody's going to benefit. So that there was a pool of people, any kind of, you can subset people however you like. So it could be people in a particular sector or people in a particular geographical space. At the time, it was through a sort of social media meetup called the Tuttle Club, which met in London from sort of, well, it still goes on now, but it's sort of golden age was 2008, 2009. And amongst those of us at Tuttle, we did an enormous amount of work together where we didn't really discuss who was going to get paid for what until it had happened, because we were more interested in the group of us that were pursuing these kind of interesting new ways of working. We were more interested in the sense that everybody did well and that the ideas were manifest in an interesting way than we were in whether or not an individual made a certain amount of money. And the couple of times that someone did try and game it, they just stopped being part of the equation. I mean, it wasn't a conscious kind of ganging up. It was they were talking a different language to the rest of us. And so as a result, a lot of us ended up with some really interesting work, and Amplified came out of that and became a fabulously sustainable way of social technologists using their skills for good, in environments where people weren't necessarily as fluent and literate with those kind of tools. We were able to take them and share them it was a very open source kind of way of doing things, and that seemed to be quite key, that there was very little that was considered commercially sensitive at all in that space, that we were swapping ideas and throwing them around, because we all saw that again, another Toby Moore's phrase is the future's too complex to go it alone. we saw that if one of us had an idea and stuck with it, it would die because it was on its own. That actually all of our ideas needed to be bashed around in the group, and they needed a critical mass of people who were exploring certain things. So whether that was the way that something which seems as banal now as how Twitter could be used as a conversational medium at events that was then useful as an output from those events. So the first time I met you was at the Civil Service Live, and we were able to come as amplified to that event, and we did multiple things. I mean, we were able to kind of talk to civil service and say, this is what you could do, and we weren't trying to sell them a service. We were saying, look, you can go and do this. It was very much about empowering them, because we saw an environment in which people were more fluent and more comfortable with social media, that we would be okay in that space because we understood it, and so we didn't have to kind of protect anything. The free movement of ideas was fundamentally a good thing. And I think I have a theory about why that is. I think it's because freelancers, because we have no expensive infrastructure around us, we're not worried about having to make 10 grand a week to pay the office bill. We're not thinking about, these kind of stupidly huge headline figures where if our company doesn't make $750,000 a year, we're going to go under. We're going, no, I just need to make enough money to pay the bills and then I'm okay. So we can be much freer in our thinking, because finding a place to make 200 or 300 quid is a lot easier than thinking, well, if this contract isn't worth 100 grand to us, we're screwed. That it's very difficult to be innovative when there's 100 to 500 grand on the line. It's very, very difficult to innovate in a space where you're talking with figures like that. It takes a very different mindset to think in those kind of numbers. And there are people who do it. There are people who do it incredibly well. I don't think anyone transitions that smoothly from being a sole operative to doing that. And so as a result, we were able to be much more fluid in our kind of dealings with one another, because you'd get a gig and go, oh, great, well, here's a couple hundred quid, thanks for helping out. And 3 of those in a week, you've made 600 quid and it's your month's rent. It really was on that kind of level. It was very pragmatic, very, very egalitarian. That one of the fun things about Tuttle at that point, the Tuttle Club, was that you had no idea who in the room had money and who didn't. Because there were a couple of people there who were, I would guess, were reasonably well off, given what their jobs were and their environment, but there was no sense of social hierarchy at all. Everybody was just chucking ideas in, and everybody was benefiting, and that felt really that felt novel. That didn't feel very businesslike. It didn't feel like working in an office where there were bosses and middle managers and serfs at the bottom. That instead it was just a bunch of people. It was very meritocratic. If people had good ideas, those ideas got shared, and people did things with them, and everybody went, "He's the guy with the good ideas." And yeah, it was great. It was really useful. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's funny. Today is National Freelancers Day, and the conversation on Twitter this morning began with a bunch of people who'd obviously read about it in the paper and had gone, "Oh, it's National Freelancers Day, therefore I'm going to stay in bed and worry about where my next meal's going to come from." There's this perception that actually freelancing is incredibly fraught with the potential to suddenly go bust. And I think that back to what I was saying at the start about the binary nature of employment, you're either employed or you're not. And if you're a freelancer, there's always the potential of a bit of work coming in. There's always little bits happening here and there, and it might be 20 quid or 50 quid, or it might be 10 grand. You never know what's going to happen. So there's an uncertainty to it, but that brings with it kind of an opportunity and excitement and things. So I think the thing that I found was most different about me, and it wasn't something I found difficult, but it was something that I observed as different, is that I was never able to plan based on expected income. So I've never taken out a loan. I got a credit card 2 years ago because just for the purpose of renting cars, because we were touring in the States and we couldn't rent a car without a credit card. I never ever spent money I didn't have. Because as a freelancer, I realised that if I did, I would then be bricking it, wondering where that money was going to come from, because you just don't know. And so instead I was much more existential about those kind of things. So rather than knowing that I had 1,500, 2 grand, 3 grand a month coming in, I would wait until it came in and then go, great, well, what do I need to do with this? I need to put that amount aside for tax and that amount for whatever. And so things were done in a very different kind of way. And so I guess there are the big dangers of it are, one, obviously, that you end up with no work, but that can happen if you're employed. The other is that you get so paranoid with the kind of planning side of things that you just start stockpiling cash and get terrified because you're going to go bust, and actually lose that spontaneity that makes freelancing so much fun and makes, you know, the entrepreneurial drive so different from working in an office. And I guess that the last one for me is that the times that you spend on your own. And I know a lot of freelancers, particularly writers, people who write for a living, so sat on their own at home in a room, you know. And if you're dealing with particularly if you have sort of things that would in any other setting be thought was mental ill health, angst, depression, you don't spot it. No one diagnoses it because it's just you on your own at home. So I think there's a danger of isolation that can be there, and that's where the opportunity to get together, whether that's just working in a coffee shop instead of at home, or something more serendipitous like the Tuttle Club, or organisations that actually being able to get together and say, wow, I'm having a really tough time of it, and someone else say, you know, I think you ought to go and see a doctor. Or just say, yeah, I feel pretty crappy too. It's kind of the, you know, it's that time of year. No one in our line of work gets any work now. And you go, really? God, I thought it was just me. Because obviously in all industries fluctuate. And if you're a musician, if you're not doing panto in December, there's no work. If you're doing panto, it's great, it's Life of Riley. But December can be slow. January's incredibly slow. New Year, you try and get a big New Year gig to pay for January. But January's a really slow month. And if you don't know that, and you've just become a musician, then you're going to be going, oh, my career's ended. What can I do? January's completely dead. I've got nothing in. And if you know, you plan ahead for that. And so what you need is someone around to say, hey, don't do any big spending in December because you're going to need that money for January. And you've also got your tax bill coming up at the end of the month, so make sure you can pay that. That kind of stuff is vital. And so I think that those would be the three for me. Freelancing would be the insecurity of the work, if you happen to be, especially if you've got one string to your bow, the sense of aloneness, and what was that? I can't remember what the third one was. We'll have to edit this. I did three, didn't I?
The mental health bit.
That was the third. That was the third bit about being on your own. So it's being on your own. Forgetting things. Anyway, we can edit that bit out. We'll cut back to that. So there are a number of things that are problematic, but I think none of them are endemic. They can all be mitigated, and they all have an equal and opposite benefit that you just have to roll with. I mean, I think it's one of my great skills in life is finding the good in things, and so I'm quite often in a situation where I'm going, that was brilliant, that was terrible, that was awful. I'm going, no, but what about this angle? And people are worrying about things that I kind of would just ignore because I go, well, that's the bad bit, but what about the good bit? And so I do that with freelancing. So I woke up this morning with it being National Freelancers Day and thought, isn't it great? I love my life. This is fabulous. And, you know, and approximately what I'd make as an assistant manager in McDonald's. You know, it's not like I'm making a lot of money, but I don't need to. And I have my family and I we moved out of London because we weren't willing to pay that £1,000 a month tax just to have a place in London, that when we could get a much nicer place by living in Birmingham, and I can still work down here. So that if you have that kind of liberty of thought process, then actually it's that there aren't really any downsides. There are only obstacles that need processing and dealing with. And if you're unwilling to, then yeah, you know, London's a particularly hostile environment for freelancers, because if you're trying to rent a house, they're going to go, okay, we want 17 years books and a kidney, and you know, we need a photocopy of your face so we can prove who you are, and it just is crazy stuff. Whereas, you know, if you've got a job, it's just a pay slip, and then they'll go, great, oh, you have a job, you're a proper human being, not a fake one. And so that sort of stuff is tricky, but there's ways around it. There's always ways around it, and I wouldn't swap what I do for anything.